Welcome to the Last Line of Defense. I am thrilled to have General Mick Ryan with us today. Mick spent 35 years in the Australian Army and commanded soldiers at multiple levels, but I'm particularly interested in talking to Mick because he has just returned from Ukraine. So we wanted to get some fresh perspective from the front lines. Mick, I think it's your sixth trip. Is that right?
Yeah, it's something like that. I think it was my sixth, but it was really good to get back there, see some old friends, and uh, get some insights into where the war is. It changes, every 6 months or so. It's a very different war.
Yeah. So let's start with that. So Mick, how would you describe the state of the war right now? And as part of that, where are the primary Russian axes of advance?
I think we're at a point where Ukraine is preventing Russia from winning, but isn't in a position to win it itself. It has been generally pretty successful on the ground in slowing but not stopping Russia's territorial gains, and it's ensured that any gains the Russians do make come at a very significant cost. Although, to be quite frank, the cost they're imposing on the Russians still isn't enough. It's probably a 2.5 to 1 ratio at the moment. It needs to be probably 4 or 5 to 1, given the disparity in populations. In the air, I think Ukraine is having significantly more success. Not only are they demonstrating significant adaptation, learning, and innovation in their ground-based air defences, their long-range strike capability continues to go from strength to strength. They built it from nothing over a 3.5 year period, and it now features both exquisite Western and indigenous Ukrainian systems, Western and Ukrainian intelligence gathering, and is generally able to penetrate Russian airspace where it needs to, notwithstanding the fact that the Russians are also learning and adapting and continuously evolving their air defense posture.
So, Mick, a big chunk of the focus has been the Russian push into the area around Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, in and around Donetsk. I mean, what is your sense about what the Russian strategy is and operations are around those front lines, and what is your sense also about what those front lines actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, Pokrovsk is the main effort. It has been for about a year, primarily because it's an enabler to achieving one of Putin's key objectives, which is securing the Donbass. Pokrovsk is one of the fortress cities of the east. Securing that gives him not just a launch pad for looking to the north to cities like Kramatorsk, but also launch potential offensives further into Dnipro. Further to the north, the supporting advance is on Kupiansk and that area. It hasn't been as successful. It had some limited success in getting to and across the Oskil River, but hasn't really moved much further since then. And the city of Kharkiv remains outside artillery range, thank goodness. But at the end of the day, the primary ground objective is to secure the Donbass, but also to support the political objective of Putin, which is project to politicians in the West that Russian victory is inevitable and they shouldn't support Ukraine and that they should come to an agreement with Russia about this war.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment. I think dispel some of the Russian claims of success. I think the data, certainly, at least that I've looked at, and some of that we've compiled, paints a much darker picture for the Russians. But how would you describe the front lines? So, sort of visually, what do they look like right now? And when people talk about a lot of the unmanned or uncrewed systems, including drones, what else do you see as you start to approach the front lines, including infantry, and how critical are particularly dismounted infantry to that fight? So as you start to approach the lines, what do you see there? What does the constitution of military efforts at that level look like?
Well, the closer you get to the front line, the less you see. The threat from drones means that anything above the ground is either dead or is moving really, really fast. So much of the military effort is actually underground. Trench lines are covered, headquarters are buried deep underground from which they control drone operations as well as combined arms operations. Everything's camouflaged, there's decoys. The things that are moving have lots of EW antennas. They often move under drone nets and they move at extraordinarily fast speeds. It's exactly the opposite to, say, what you and I saw when we visited Israel and southern Israel in 2003, where military power was fully on display. It's just not like that. Military power is almost invisible, but as soon as you make yourself visible, the power of drones, artillery, and other kinetic systems become fully apparent to you.
So, Mick, what is your general sense about the costs of the war so far for the Russians? If you look at some indicators, they pushed over the 1 million casualty mark over the summer. I've looked at some of the rates of advance on some of the axes. They are slower than what we saw during the Battle of the Somme during World War One. Not all axes, but some of them have been glacially slow. It's interesting when you start the clock at the German invasion of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, and you fast forward 3 years and about 9 months, the Soviet Red Army is in Berlin. They have prevented a successful Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and then they've pushed on offense. And if you start the clock, same timelines in February of 2022, and you fast forward 3 years and roughly 9 months, you get the Russians around Pokrovsk, which is what you've described as the area they've been fighting for about a year or so. I mean, that does not, to me, and I realize I'm sort of leading the witness here, but that does not sound like to me like huge military success. But do you see it differently?
No, I don't think the Russians have been hugely successful. They have learned, they have improved. Their systemic learning has got better. And in some respects, they've out-innovated the Ukrainians in tactics and drone operations in the last 6 months or so. So the question is, if they have all these advantages, why aren't they better? Why aren't they moving more quickly? And I think there's a bunch of different answers to that, including, lower average quality of Russian soldiers, lower average quality of will on the ground compared to the Ukrainians. Plus, the Ukrainians are working on internal lines and they're fighting for their own territory. So the Russians are being mildly successful, and Putin's calculus, I think, is more about just being able to outlast the Ukrainians by one day. He doesn't have to reach Kiev in this phase of the war. He just needs to secure some kind of political accommodation that, one, allows him to portray a win at home, and two, postures him for what he might like to do in future against Ukraine.
So I want to come back to some of those asymmetric advantages that the Russians might have. I do want to talk a little bit later about systemic and strategic adaptation, because you've written about that as well. But before we do that, can you talk a little bit about, from your vantage point, visiting Ukraine, talking to senior Ukrainian officials and Westerners, and then visiting some of the key areas close to the front lines? Where are the Ukrainians having the most success, and where are they having the most significant challenges?
I think the Ukrainians are having pretty good success when it comes to the use of their drone forces. I mean, clearly these have become their centre of gravity as a way to overcome the very significant shortfalls in people that they have. So the drones, their drone operation centres, are pretty successful in a relative sense, even though they now have a shortfall in drone operators, just because there's so many drone units been established and it's hard to keep up with the requirement. I think the innovation in the drones themselves has been pretty significant in both short, medium and their long-range drones, which are used for strikes deep inside Russia. But also, I think their success with the diverse range of drones comes at a price, and that is they're not really producing any one drone in huge numbers, like, say, the US did in World War II. So there's an industrial diversification that might hurt them in the long run, which, the Russians pick a couple of winners and just go with those. So I think
Right.
there's a challenge. There's both good and bad in the drone story. I think, too, that, Ukraine is having some problem cutting through outside Ukraine, telling its story, sustaining Western support, getting its narrative out about why Ukraine is important to continue supporting. There is a bit of a strategic impatience in the West. There's a bit of war weariness, even though it's hard to see why that might be. But Russian and Chinese misinformation is also cutting through, particularly when you have these corruption scandals, as we've seen just in the last week or two in Ukraine.
Yeah, those certainly aren't helpful. One interesting part of Ukrainian strategy is long range and deep strikes, and it was the subject when President Zelensky visited President Trump recently, and I saw President Zelensky after that. Part of the conversation was on Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. I don't think the Ukrainians fully expected to get them, but they had been pushing for long range strike that was longer than, say, Storm Shadow, that would conduct deep strikes against Russian targets. Yellow Buga, for example, the industrial facility that the Iranians have helped set up that's building Shaheeds, and a number of other locations, oil and gas facilities, air bases, and other parts of Russia's industrial base, including ones in and around cities like Moscow. So the way President Zelensky and other senior Ukrainian leaders really have started talking about it to some degree has been on continuing to develop Ukrainian long-range strike, including some of the missiles like Flamingo. What is it your sense right now when it comes to deep strike? What are Ukrainians trying to do, and what do their capabilities look like over the next couple of months?
Well, I think there's been a couple of important political achievements in the last 6 months or so. Firstly, the Ukrainians have normalized with the US administration these deep strike activities and securing US intelligence to help in planning for them. I don't think we can underestimate just how important that is. No one has the ability to collect intelligence and mensurate targets like the US military. It's something they've developed over multiple decades. No other country in the world has it. And for the Ukrainians to be able to get that, it's orders of magnitude more valuable than a few dozen Tomahawks. So I think normalizing those long-range strikes with the US administration, building an understanding in US policymakers that long-range strikes against power and defense industrial targets in Russia aren't going to result in a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C., that seemed to be the fear of some in the past administration. So I think that's been a really important achievement. But I also think they've achieved the ability to design, to iterate and produce long-range missiles in quantity that can overwhelm Russian air defences, decoy air defences, and hit targets, importantly, with large warheads to cause sufficient damage to shut these facilities down for more than 24 hours.
And of course, Mick, we've also seen the use of drones, including smuggling them into Russian territory and using them that we saw during Operation Spider's Web to conduct strikes against strategic targets by the Russians. Not the same kind of deep strike that, say, the Flamingo could have, particularly if it's fired from Ukrainian territory. But they've also been innovative in how they've done it. Are these kinds of efforts having any notable impact on Russia militarily, politically, economically, in your judgment?
I don't think they're having a political impact domestically. I mean, Putin controls all the levers of information, so I don't see a political impact for him. I think we're starting to see an economic impact. I mean, the the strikes on the Russian port on the Black Sea just a few nights ago cut off 2% of the world's oil trade. So, if you cut off 2% of US oil trade, that would have a fairly significant impact. Just the logic follows, it would have an impact. So I think there is an impact. We're seeing some signs of that, but I don't think that means Russia's economy is going to collapse tomorrow. I think countries are remarkably resilient when it comes to these kind of things, as we've seen from North Korea and other countries over many years. The impact of spiderweb isn't just on Russia. I think it should be terrifying anyone who's responsible for base security in America, Australia, or the West. It means a foreign national who's an adversary could come in by themselves, go to your local drone shop, buy 50 drones, steal some explosives, and take out B-2 bombers, F-22s, or expensive military materiel at very low cost. And generally, military bases aren't well prepared for that.
No, I mean, having visited Kadena Air Force Base recently in Okinawa, I mean, they don't even have hardened shelters for U.S. fifth generation aircraft. So whether they're deployed in countries like the United States or U.S. Aircraft or other assets deployed overseas, they're potentially vulnerable. When it comes to other efforts to impact Russia's economy, President Zelensky in our conversation continue to hope that the U.S., the West, impose more primary and secondary sanctions against the Russians. Do you hear much about that? And any general sense of success down the road that one is likely to see? Did the sanctions issue come up much when you were there?
The Ukrainian intelligence certainly gave me a brief on, the sanctions by the West versus what their strikes were having, and their sense was their strikes magnifying the impact of the sanctions. So there's an integrated effect between Ukraine's strikes on Russia's oil refineries and other economic facilities and the sanctions. But I think, there is a desire to have more secondary sanctions. India, China and others who are major importers of Russian energy. But, going down the route of secondary sanctions against China is a whole very different ballgame, as we've really seen.
Yep.
And, the Trump administration has been trying to reach an accommodation with China on a whole range of trade issues. So I don't see any prospect of secondary sanctions against China, at least in the short term.
Yeah. So, Mick, what is your general sense about when it comes to Western aid, whether it's European or U.S., where does that stand right now? What's the extent of assistance? And, people often think primarily of equipment, munitions, but there's also intelligence for strike. So how would you characterize assistance to Ukraine right now, and how much more is needed?
Yeah, I think on military assistance, the era of providing, shipping in lots of tanks and armored vehicles is probably coming to a close. It's now more about how much can we fund building in Ukraine, not just drones, but missiles, armored vehicles, munitions, other things like that. So I think the balance is shifting to investing in industry that can build stuff in Ukraine at lower costs.
Ukrainian industry.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Europe is in two minds about that. They'd like to do that, but they're also trying to rebuild their defence industry, and they don't want to compete with the Ukrainians. So it's a tricky issue, but it's a shifting balance, I think. I think you're starting to see a high level of Western companies setting up shop in Ukraine to maintain equipment that's there. Rheinmetall, Turkish companies, a bunch of others are in there doing things. The intelligence side of things is extraordinarily important. I think American targeting data is, that is the gold standard. And if you've got that, you're much better off than what you
100%.
don't.
Yep.
I think support with cyber, but also misinformation, public diplomacy, those kind of things is extraordinarily important. I think the head of NATO has been pretty good at that. There are some European politicians who are pretty good at that. That's the morale. That's the psychological side of the war that is important. And the final bit is training. I think, the Ukrainians are keen to move as much foreign training back into Ukraine in the coming year, or as close as possible to Ukraine's borders. That there is deep appreciation of the training that's been delivered in England, Scandinavia, and other countries, but there's a growing realisation that they need to homeshore more of that training, so people aren't spending as long as they are travelling to and from this training, and there's a better alignment between training conducted in Ukraine and NATO-delivered training.
Yeah. So, Mick, one of the things you have written about is pushing back against the notion that we often hear from people that have at least cursorily looked at Ukraine and said it is primarily a drone war. So I think you've written that it is not a drone war in your perspective, that it's a war where drones have gained prominence, but they don't replace human capacity. They largely extend it. Can you explain what you mean by that and sort of how drones then actually fit into the war?
Yeah, sure. I mean, great American academic Daniel Marsden used to always tell the students at the Staff College in Australia, war is war. There's no such thing as this war or that war, it's just war. And I think we need to remember that. Drones have played an extraordinary role in this conflict, but they haven't won the war. I mean, the mobilisation has played an important part. Infantry, artillery, mines have all played important roles, and it's their integration into a national warfighting effort that sees success or failure, not just the role of drones. So we need to make sure we contextualise the role of drones, that they are not replacing humans on the battlefield. That's certainly not how the Ukrainians see it. They see drones as extending the capacity of the combined arms team on the ground as well as in the air. I think there have been a few too many drone zealots who see drones as the future war. I don't believe that's the case. And indeed, the role of drones is very different, as you and I know, in Israel, and it will be very different in the Pacific. So it is a war in which drones have played a prominent part, but it is just a war, not a drone war.
So what else do you see then, at least in the Ukraine context, of what is critical to either seize territory, so offense, or to defend it on the defensive side?
Well, I think the critical enabler of both of those is mobilisation. This is the hottest of hot potatoes in Ukrainian politics, but I'm not sure their current approach to mobilisation is sustainable. Exempting young men between 18 and 25 is pretty unprecedented for any nation fighting a war in the last 200 or more years.
And Mick, just if I can interrupt you for 1 second, your sense about what the politics of that is in Ukraine, particularly for President Zelensky.
It is very, very difficult. I mean, just getting through the last set of laws that were passed in May this year to bring the mobilisation age down to 25 took about 18 months worth of negotiation amongst politicians. So it is the most difficult task in Ukraine at the moment, but it is the one thing that could change Ukraine's prospect by opening up the valve on young Ukrainians, as well as those who are given study exemptions for 2 hours study a week or more. I mean, if you visit frontline units and you see the soldiers, they're all my age.
No.
Now, I was a brigade commander at 45.
That's young, though.
And it was...
That's young, isn't it? Isn't that young?
It's very young. But that's not how wars should be fought. It is not an old man's game. It really isn't. And whilst it's admirable that so many older Ukrainians have stepped up to the plate, like enormously admirable and courageous, but you need younger, more energetic people who have certain kinds of resilience and sustainability as well. And I think Ukraine probably really needs to think hard about opening up the floodgate, not shutting it off like it has at the moment.
Yeah. We're just about at the end, Mick. One question that I wanted to end on is Putin often refers to this war as a war against NATO. So this is the way domestically pitches it to his population. Yet at the same time, his own industrial base receives significant assistance from the Chinese, including components, North Korean aid, including soldiers, artillery, rockets, and then obviously Iranian assistance as well, including Shaheeds. How much did this come up, and to what degree was this having an impact on the battlefield, Russian assistance from outside powers?
No, absolutely. They see it. Ukrainian intelligence and frontline units see this. They understand the huge degree of assistance China's given Ukraine, whether it's been streamlining industrial production or providing the financial wherewithal for Russia to fight this war. North Korea, even though it's started to reduce the quantity of munitions, has provided around a third of Russian artillery munitions over the last year or so. It's an enormous quantity, and it allows Russia to, focus on other items of production. Now, that's probably going to change over the next year as North Korea's stockpiles start to reduce. But, North Korea, Iran, and China have played a pivotal role in this war. The four countries are now learning and adapting together more quickly and at a quality we probably didn't anticipate even a year ago. And we need to be able to respond to that new adversary learning and adaptation block that's formed.
Well, Mick, thank you so much for spending a little time with us on the last line of defense. I mean, what is particularly helpful is to hear perspectives, not just from a military expert like you have 35 plus years serving the Australian Army, and then obviously deployments to places like Afghanistan and the Pentagon, separate battlefields, one bureaucratic,
very different war zones.
Yeah, but also the time you've taken to go visit multiple times the Ukrainian battlefield. That perspective is so important. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us, and we really look forward to talking again soon. So stay safe.
Thanks, Seth. Really appreciate it. And congratulations to you on your new book. I'm about halfway through, and it is fantastic. I recommend it to all your listeners.
And I promise I didn't pay you to say that. So thanks, Mick. Really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today. This is The Last Line of Defense. Thanks for listening to our episode today. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more analysis, please visit csis.org. This is The Last Line of Defense.